Hello and welcome everyone out there in Zoom land to this third successive weekly ACOR Snap session where, as an industry association, we're trying to share some of the work from our projects and our policy development with our stakeholders, be they from industry, state governments, local governments, the consultancy world, the broader...
My phone's nearly dead, so I need to charge one.
The broader recycling fraternity. So, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land, no matter where we are in this great country. I'm on the land of the Burmagadigal clan of the Darug Nation here in Western Sydney, which I always say is the most biggest concentration of recycling jobs anywhere in the country, about 10,000 recycling jobs here in Western Sydney. Hence, the industry association is at the moment based here. I sometimes take for granted that people know a fair bit about ACOR, perhaps not. We are obviously a peak body for the resource recovery industry, which is valued at about $15 to $20 billion a year at the moment, employs approximately 50,000 people, which is very significant. When you compare that to agriculture, it's about 1/3 the size of agriculture. Who are the members? What does the industry consist of? It consists of companies that collect materials. It consists of companies that segregate or sort materials. It consists of companies that value add the materials, for example, in the case of plastics, back into resin. And then, of course, and uniquely, companies that actually make recycled content products. Where ACOR is a little bit different is that it encompasses that entire supply chain, particularly manufacturers. Many of my members, ladies and gentlemen, don't think of themselves as recyclers. They think of themselves as manufacturers, and they happen to be involved in a recycling supply chain. Where a little bit also interesting is the depth of materials that we cover. Whereas things like plastics, which we'll talk about today, and curbside materials get a lot of focus, and that's understandable because of their consumer aspect. Our members are very heavily, for example, into construction and demolition materials, product stewardship materials such as batteries, e-waste, the lot. So we have some width and we have some depth across materials and across the three established race streams of MSW, CNI, and CND. And I guess that's what gives us a very diverse discussion when members sit down to have a chat about things in terms of policy and projects for the betterment of resource recovery. And one of the observations that was recently made, and this takes me into talking about plastics reduction offset scheme today and the paper that it's based on. One of the observations from many members is, in all this discussion about recycling targets, about progress, etc., there is a lack of discussion about one fundamental factor. We talk about frameworks, and we talk about objectives, and we talk about policies, and we talk about behavioral change. And what we don't talk about is money. Groshi, dengue, dinero, mula. Any other languages anybody wants to contribute to? Synonyms for money? Come on.
Spondolix.
Oh, what's that?
Money.
So, look, you know, am I barking up the wrong tree? Do people on the call get a sense that often we have these elaborate discussions about things like the circular economy without talking about economics? And yet, if you take a look at, for example, at least at my members, you know, what they spend, you know, the vast majority of their time concentrating on is their P&Ls, their balance sheets, and how do you actually make the process of recycling add up in a profitable, sustainable way in order that it does meet targets and generate environmental benefits, et cetera, et cetera. In light of that, what we decided to do is to commission a gentleman named Peter Krohn to look a little bit more deeply at some of the economic issues in recycling, and particularly whether or not it was worth considering more incentives for the process, or whether or not the current suite of policies was sufficient to get us to things like a 70% plastics recycling target or an 80% overall waste reduction target as enshrined in the National Waste Policy. Who's Crone? Crone is a longtime advisor to center-right governments in this country. He is one of the people who was literally at the table as the GST was being developed way back when under John Howard. He would normally be giving this presentation, but because Peter is a in-demand person, Peter has now been engaged by the National COVID Recovery Commission to work on economic policies as we come out of the pandemic. So I'll do my best to have a fist at describing the content of the paper, its whys and its hows. The paper's also been distributed to you, and we can engage through the chat function. I encourage you to do that in terms of questions and comments as we go along as well, and as you get your head around the paper. If at some point people want to get more technical into the actual mechanism of the PROS or PROS or Plastics Reduction Offset Scheme, we can organize that too. Okay, so when we look at money and recycling, what we find is that some materials pay for themselves in the overall system. So for example, construction and demolition materials, it is necessarily cheaper in most parts of the country, most of the time, to recycle that material than it is to dispose of it to landfill. Why? Landfill levies are particularly effective when material is homogeneous and heavy. They are less effective in terms of providing an incentive when the material is lighter and heterogeneous. So classically, where we see a market failure in particular is around plastics, because the landfill levy isn't enough of a direct signal to get that equation right between the costs of recycling and the value extracted from the material in its final form as it goes to a manufacturer. So for at least part of the recycling spectrum, not all of the recycling spectrum, but particularly as materials get lighter and more heterogeneous, think about curbside recycling, think about product stewardship type materials, as opposed to rubble, road materials, timber, etc., etc. The game becomes this. Is that the right way around or the wrong way around? I have no idea. So you have to, in the first instance, try to put downward pressure on your costs, achieve efficiencies in the whole process along that supply chain of collection, delivery, segregation, value adding, and then remanufacture. So when you look around right now, there are a whole series of efforts in the country, some of them enshrined in the National Waste Policy, others in state policies and regulation, to try to put downward pressure on the costs. An example, contamination from curbside recycling as a result of consumers perhaps being confused or perhaps not having enough information or perhaps having the wrong information from whomever are putting the wrong things in the wrong bins. That results in a cost in the system, and we'll actually circle back to that. It's probably in the neighborhood of $150 million a year right now that recyclers pay as a result of that contamination. So people are right now all over the place trying to say, okay, how do we educate people better? How do we develop, apps like ACOR is doing to help give them more information? A good discussion right now about how do we standardize curbside recycling? Because again, if you get more uniformity and consistency across hundreds of curbside recycling systems, as opposed to the variations that we see now, your systemic cost comes down. So cost reduction efficiency is a major effort from everybody right now. And at the same time, how do you increase the value of the materials that are being produced by the system? And that obviously is a question of demand. The price that people are willing to pay for the material that is collected and then goes through the process. And for example, the key policy levers that are being used at the moment to try to increase and drive and sustain demand are effectively twofold. One is the investment in new technology and new infrastructure, and that's where things like the Recycling Modernization Fund fits in. The money that's been allocated by the Commonwealth government, some $190 million, together with the matching funds, hopefully, from the state governments, and then the matching funds from industry to do things like put in place the gear to actually process the equipment in a logical manner. And the other piece of that puzzle that is now very clearly part of the policy suite, but not necessarily well implemented yet, is the notion of recycled content purchasing or positive procurement or whatever you wish to deem it. E.g., whether it's in the private sector, you're a Unilever, a Coke, a Nestle, a whomever, that you are specifying more recycled content in your packs, in your products, or from the public sector perspective, that let's say you are the Department of Defense or you're building Western Sydney Airport, that you are doing more to ask for recycled content in the various things that you purchase for that project, be they on the construction side, be on fit out side, be it on the operational side, for example, of an airport, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, effectively, efficiency and earnings. Efficiencies need to improve and earnings need to improve to try to address market failures around some segments of recycling. And indeed, Krohn in his report on page 2 has the following, I think, incisive statement. And remember, Krohn is new to recycling. He's an economist. He's been asked to look at something independently and objectively here. And he is a center-right person, so he understands the values, the assumptions, the parameters with which, for example, the current federal government could be operating. And Krohn writes that despite the goodwill and the policy commitments from all levels of government at the moment, the reality is that Australia is a long way off achieving the ambitious recycling targets it has set itself, especially for plastics recycling. I've commented publicly a lot to say that I don't believe there is a precedent anywhere in the world for a system to reach these kind of targets that is predicated largely on voluntary action and continual improvement, as important as all that voluntary action and continual improvement is. Krohn continues, to achieve these targets, bold new thinking will be needed that extends beyond the current suite of policies envisaged. So, no one here is rubbishing any of the work by people like APCO or by state governments or by anybody at the moment, but they come within a particular set of assumptions that voluntarism is the primary path that we're going to follow. It's not laissez-faire by any means, not just letting things happen organically. There's intervention there, but it's limited to things like programmatic interventions as opposed largely to economic instruments. Economic instruments almost reserved entirely for landfill levies and here and there some product stewardship requirements. So Krohn says that we have to go further. Okay, how does he suggest that we go further? Well, before we get to that, he reviews the lay of the land, if you will, in terms of Australia, in terms of waste targets, et cetera, and current policy settings to come to the conclusion that I just read you. One of the key things that he highlights is something called the Recycling Market Situation Report, which was done in 2019 by the federal government and went nowhere. No one noticed almost that it was prepared or that it was released. And it was a kind of detailed examination of what are the market conditions according to different materials. And one of the things that the Recycling Market Situation Report found, again, this is a Commonwealth government document done by consultants on their behalf, said the following: the Recycling Market Situation Report suggested that recycled plastics in particular have to be 10 to 20% cheaper than virgin resin to justify the additional purchasing, handling, processing, and quality assurance that puts cost inputs associated with introducing a new and significant proportion of high quality recycled content into the material mix. Okay, so again, go back to costs and value. At the moment, the costs of collecting, sorting, adding value to, and then using plastic in a new product are greater than the value at which that product is sold. A. B, the value of that product is uncompetitive compared to virgin equivalents. Why? The OECD has studied this issue in very close detail, and it's simply a factor of supply and demand. particularly when the world is, whether we like it or not, in an energy glut. There's actually more oil out there than there has been in decades. The United States is closer to energy independence than it has been in decades due to things like fracking, which we may not like, but impacts on a whole bunch of different things. And fundamentally, it's cheaper and easier for people to use virgin material, particularly in places like China, where labor costs are lower and energy operational costs are lower and all your costs are lower, compared to recycled resin made in this country, for example, which is subject to higher labor costs, higher energy costs, and that whole complex supply chain. So what Krohn basically is saying is that if we have any hope in hell of trying to get to a recycling target of 70% or a sub-target of 20% recycled content for HDP or PET, what we have to do is we have to have greater parity in the system. There has to be greater competitiveness between virgin resin and recycled resin. How do you do that? Well, again, you drive costs down. How do you get earnings up? How do you get more money into the system? And what he does is he looks at a whole series of mechanisms that have been traditionally used in different societies, including things like plastics taxes, differential VAT arrangements for the use of recycled content, etc. And he finds that in those two cases in particular, he does not believe that that will have an immediate impact in terms of behavioral change. He basically argues that it's logistically too difficult. So for example, do you put the plastics tax here, here, or here in terms of a supply chain? Difficult to establish. More important, he actually does a review of the use of plastics taxes and the use of differential VATs in many other societies. And he could not find, this was very interesting to me, I went into this with open mind, he could not find substantial evidence that there had been a significant increase in recycled content take-up as a result of those kind of measures. Fascinating, but that's what the evidence shows. So having cleared that hurdle, Krohn then had to ask himself, well, what other economic mechanisms exist that can drive that recycled content usage up, that can create that parity between recycled content and virgin, and that are actually doable in our political context, our policy context, etc. And what Krohn has developed and is now forwarding, and ACOR is having extensive discussions with folks about and has briefed ministers about, is something called the Plastics Reduction Offset Scheme, PROS. And what PROS basically is, the best analogy or metaphor that you might think about or recall is it's essentially the carbon emissions model transferred to the plastics recycling space. So many of you will remember the concept of carbon emissions trading, and we won't get into the politics of why it is with us or isn't with us nowadays, but it was essentially a fairly straightforward mechanism. And it showed, and as Krohn has an excellent example on page 21, if you're following, that basically you end up with a model that looks a little bit like that. So at benchmark is essentially the plastics target. So whether that target is a recycling target or a recycled content target, probably a recycled content target, probably by material type, probably by industry type. If you are effectively exceeding that benchmark in terms of your performance, if you're doing better than the target, you effectively go into credit. And if you are not hitting the target or the benchmark, you go into deficit. However, you are obliged, e.g., what you can do is buy credits off the people who are overperforming the benchmark. So effectively what you're doing is you're establishing an additional market for recycled content certificates that is over and above their current commodity price. How would you set the certificate level? Well, effectively, it's the differential. So if we assume that a unit of plastic, virgin plastic costs 100 X, and that recycled content plastic is currently at, let's say, 120, then the differential, that $20, is the value of the credit per unit or per ton or per whatever the economic calculus is going to be. All right. So as a worked example, if you're Smith's shampoo company and you are using recycled content HDPE over the target level of 100, let's say that you're using 120 recycled content units in a year, well, you're 20 points up, or you're 20 certificates up. You have that additional value that you can bank as a result of your proactive decision to move to recycled content over and above the level of the target. If, however, you are Jones Shampoo Company operating across the street, and for a variety of reasons, be they operational, be they your customer base, be they any number of different things, your capacity to invest, you name it, you can't get to the target, you're in deficit, let's say by 20, you still have an obligation around that target. E.g., you need to go out and figure out where to buy 20's worth of certificates. You might buy it from Smith. Or Crone suggests that you do not set a lot of elaborate rules about where those offsets can be generated. So for example, let's say that you are manufacturing recycled content plastic furniture. You can generate offsets as a result of that, certificates as a result of that. Let's say that you are using soft plastics in a road as opposed to using virgin products in a road. Again, you can generate certificates and offsets that someone else in the marketplace may wish to purchase from you. So again, the whole idea is to create greater value around recycled content, and thereby to provide it with that price parity to make it competitive in the marketplace, so that people can more readily conceive of its purchase rather than at a cost impost. If you take a look at page 22, you'll see that there's a very good worked example on page 22 that, for example, using the notion of cost of virgin at $100 a unit, the cost of recyclate at $120 a unit, different scenarios based on whether you meet a target of 40%. If you meet a target of 40%, you've got about $800 worth of certificates. If you meet a target well in excess of that, let's say you get up to 80%, well, you've got $1,600 of certificates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that becomes effectively a saleable entity in and of its own right. So Crone also then takes a look at some other aspects that we should note, and that is the following. He asks himself the question, well, to do a plastics recycling offset scheme is a new thing, and doing new things is sometimes a challenge in public administration. Public administration, just like businesses, tend towards inertia. It's hard to basically disrupt that inertia and get reforms up unless there are burning platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So he looks around and says, okay, well, what's out there already in terms of economic incentives? And he, of course, returns to what I've already mentioned, and that's the landfill levies that exist in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia to some degree or not, and which currently collect approximately $2.5 billion. And look, we've heard the argument for a long time about how all this money going to landfill levies, not a lot of it coming back in terms of waste infrastructure or recycling infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And that's valid and established. But he thinks about something else. He tries to have a specific look at how are recycling companies impacted by the landfill levy. Okay, we talked today about contamination, and as a general rule of thumb, 10 to 15% loss rates from the stuff that you collect at the curb to the stuff that ends up at the back of your MRF. Some people do much better than that, but let's say that it's a 10-15% loss rate as a result of that contamination moving into the system. That contamination has to be taken out of the system, either in the form of rejected loads or in the form of stuff being picked off lines. And where does it go? It goes to landfill. It goes from a MRFer or from some other place, a recycled content manufacturer. You know, Visi, for example, has lots of contamination that it cannot use in its paper making processes. It goes to landfill. So what Krohn has done, and this is for the first time in Australia, he's actually done calculations on what is the total amount of money effectively paid by recyclers to a landfill. So here they are, they've invested heavily in capital equipment to recycle stuff, and yet they have this perverse situation where they're paying a landfill levy having made an attempt at recycling material. It's kind of not logical. So his calculation comes in that low case scenario is about $80 million, high case scenario is about $190 million on an annual basis across the country. You know, when you think about governments, that's not a staggering figure. And it's not a staggering figure when you think about the fact that they're collecting 2.5 billion in landfill levies overall. And what Krohn then says is, if we were to remove the regulatory imperatives to pay that landfill levy on what we call residuals from recycling processes, what you're effectively doing is you're putting 80 to 190 million bucks annually into the pockets of the industry, which could then be reinvested in capital equipment, which could then again go towards building new markets and new products for recycled content, like driving greater efficiencies in technology, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how does that happen though? Krohn asks himself. You know, it is always a bitch to try to get harmonization, consistency across state governments around any aspects. Take a look at COVID and borders. Think about trying to achieve harmonization and consistency in waste regulations and landfill levies, particularly when state governments, frankly, really like the revenue that they get from those revenues. It's essentially a silent tax that's easily collected. Well, what Krohn talks about is what he calls the grand bargain, and that is that it's fairly likely that the GST is going to be modified in the next 1, 2, 3 years as we come out of COVID, as governments, including state governments, look at doing different things in their own tax mixes. You would have noticed New South Wales yesterday flagged big changes to stamp duty. The states are not going to do a lot of that reform without knowing, thinking, assuming, negotiating for some greater cut of the GST or some different allocation of the GST. So what Krohn is suggesting is that a grand bargain can be struck at the COAG level, or whatever we wish to call it level nowadays, whereby effectively the feds recompense the states to the tune of $80 to $180 million for that theoretical loss of revenue of not charging recyclers for disposal of residuals. Very clean if you think about it, and very real. So for example, you know, let's go back to the example of Visi. Visi at the moment could invest in the neighborhood of between $50 and $100 million in what's called decontamination drum equipment. And that would basically take a lot more of the curbside recycling paper that currently cannot be recycled because of its quality issues and has gone overseas as a result for many, many years in the main. If you install this drum technology, you could use that paper in Australia, meet targets, not have to be reliant on export markets, et cetera, et cetera. And sure enough, when Visi talks about this technology, it says that its main impediment to the installation of this technology is it cannot get the return on investment in the current situation due to the landfill levies that it pays on residuals. So I actually have some optimism and confidence that if that measure were to go ahead, you would see a real burst of additional investment from industry without a lot of effort. So I think I might leave it there. It's 30 minutes, and that leaves us about 10 minutes to have a bit of a yak. I know that amongst the first sort of questions that I might get, or the first comments that we might get from people is, sure, but what about things like mandatory recycled content quotas? Or sure, what about things like go back to plastics taxes, et cetera, or you know, deposits on all sorts of different materials besides the beverage ones, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and I'm happy to comment on where I think this PROS model is probably more competitive than they are in the current context. I'll shut up. Who wants to talk? How about if you don't want to talk, I put some questions to some of you who I see on the list. Ta-da-da-da-da. Get ready. Get ready.
Pete, can I ask a question?
Oh, super. Who's this? Dean Troth.
Yeah, get it, mate. Hey, without trying to push any sort of barrow, like the residuals into landfill, there's an alternative, right, which is localized on-site energy from waste, right? So turning it back into heat for the MRF, or turning it back into power. Like, is there any room within Crohn's analysis for this? So, like, because in a sense, we want to try and help recyclers deal with that exact problem, paying big money for landfill to get rid of residuals. Let's turn it into stuff for the system, right? Is there a space for that? You're on mute, Pete.
That's a really good thought, Dean. And the analysis so far and the modeling that we've done around pros has been limited to recycled content. There's no reason why conceptually you couldn't say that companies should derive some credit if they find some other alternative to landfill, right? So, the way I suppose you could do it is you could think about the waste management hierarchy, yeah? And, if you assume that the waste management hierarchy, has its various levels, let's say that you are meeting recycled content targets over here, well, that might be a certificate that's worth X, for example. But as you go further down the hierarchy, I know we can have a technical argument about it. We can have a life cycle assessment argument about it, that some form of waste extraction is a little bit below that. Well, that might be worth Y. At the end of the day, what's the point is we have to set up some differentials between landfill levying and everything else. The landfill levy does that for some things, but it doesn't do it successfully for other things like plastics. So yes, it would make interesting sense to model how waste to energy, assuming a whole bunch of things in terms of what types of technologies, what kind of environmental controls, all the various checklists and social license, et cetera, apply, what credits might be worth as a plastics to waste conversion. Yes. I'm going to put that I'll put that on the to-do list.
Cool. Happy for that conversation if anyone wants to talk about it.
Yep. Who do we got? Come on.
Hey, it's Nick Harford here from
Hello,
Equilibrium.
Nicholas.
How are you?
Good, mate.
Oh, the idea of financial instruments obviously actually has a long history in the environment space. The work on NOx and SOx, and obviously even internationally now around greenhouse. But is the report suggesting that there should be a financial instrument such as the pros plus reform to the levy, or is it saying that either would have a similar effect?
Yeah. Krohn looked at the different financial instruments essentially in isolation of each other. So he just said, here's reform number 1, here's reform number 2, here's reform number 3. How do they stack up on a bunch of criteria, including their affordability, their the degree to which they could be taken up, the degree to which they are complementary of existing sort of frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. And then he came to his conclusions about pros and other things. He did not, however, look at an integrated suite, right? And I think that's a very significant aspect that we should ponder on, because that's the real world. Is that, if you are a recycler, you are a manufacturer, you're anybody else, you're not just subject to one law, one regulation. There's a whole bunch of things that you interact with. So yeah, it'd take a bit more clinical modeling to try to figure out how the things fit together. Yeah, you could argue that you should be striking a balance between some, for example, landfill levy relief and some other mechanisms. Also note that he looked only at plastics in this case. He did that essentially as a case study, right?
Yep.
You could kind of make the argument on plastics credit across a whole bunch of other light materials and materials that basically are in market failure, right?
Peter Kirk-Palmer. I'm just wondering whether he did any work on cost to process. There's a big drive here in Victoria at the moment to drive costs down for council, i.e. collection process cost,
Yeah.
which is, you know, we've seen it before, it's going to have an impact. It does have an impact on the level of processing. Was there any work done in that space?
Not specifically for this report, but, you know, Kurt, you know it, I know it, all of us who hang around the place know that there are costs that can be taken out of the system. That's not a bad thing. It should be done. However, when you look at the international experience, you only get so far in terms of cost reduction strategies. Think about your own businesses, right? You know, if you say, oh, I want to enhance profitability, you can do a couple things. You can reduce costs or you can increase sales, right? Reducing costs only gets you so far before you hit some hard walls. You can't sack your staff. You can't get rid of your energy bills, et cetera, et cetera. There's less flexibility there, and there's less elasticity in terms of how much gain you can get. Where you actually increase profit as a business and then you increase sustainability as an industry is you've got to increase that earnings column. And so, you know, that's why you do see people in Europe, the United States, Canada, elsewhere, thinking more and more about, you know, what are the mechanisms that we can look at over here. But you're right, Kurt, you know, for the next 2-3 years, we're going to see a big emphasis on cost reduction. My concern is that we're going to push cost reduction so hard, and we're going to find that the system's still not sustainable enough.
Yes, and more so that the price to council or the cost to council or whoever the owns the waste in the initial, either the curbside collection, etc. You know, they're trying to drive their costs down, which is driving the processes to bid. You know, they have to get the waste, they have to bid less, i.e., so their costs end up going up.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, so, you know, we're sending out very mixed messages to local government, aren't we, at the moment? We're basically saying you got to clean up your act in terms of the material that goes in the bin. In places like Victoria and WA and perhaps elsewhere in the country, you've now got to move to these new systems and the costs that are entailed in terms of changing over to new bins or new collection systems or whatever. And on the other hand, they're getting messages from other parts of government saying you've got to cap your rates. You know, and once you do that, you know, the price point that's available to contractors, et cetera, is also extremely constrained, right? So again, you know, if we take only a cost mentality and just try to drive down, we're going to end up with, frankly, more SKMs on our hands where, you know, the cheapest bid wins and it doesn't necessarily get you the results that you want.
Didn't want to name names, but yeah, you're absolutely right. They're
not with us anymore. We can talk badly about the dead.
Fair enough. I'll shut up now.
All righty. How about a last one? Anybody?
Hey, Pete, it's Simon from Vanden. How are you? I just had a quick question. Is much thought being put around, you know, where it would be regulated or the body that might regulate it? Because I know, you know, there's a few discussions in industry about where things should be regulated. Yep.
So as far as Crone goes in his paper, because the paper basically was written as sort of an introduction of the concept to ministers in particular, all he suggests is what he calls a regulatory center, that obviously somebody has to be kind of the rule maker and the gatekeeper in terms of issuing the certificates, verifying the fact that, you know, in this case, for instance, you know, Smith's is 20 in credit. In a legitimate way, that material has actually been used as recycled content, that it's traceable, et cetera, et cetera. Again, you know, there's a significant role for a regulatory center. He doesn't nominate who that regulatory center should be. You'd have a lot of ideas. I'd have a lot of ideas. And you know, and it also comes down to who could actually capably do it. You know, the Commonwealth has a lot of enthusiasm in the area of waste and recycling now. Do they have all the capability? Or do the states have the capability? Some combination, or do you get really innovative and you basically do an outsourced kind of regulator on it, right? You've got models around the world where basically systems like this are effectively governed by, not by government per se, but by agencies that are set up and incentivized by government to exist. And that might be interesting, right? You know, that you almost have like a kind of a public-private partnership that basically gets to run the system, almost like a stock market, right? You know, it's there, but it exists very much within the constraints and the rules that are established by government. It's not a pure stock market. Alrighty. With that, we're at our exact 45 minutes. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us and tolerating me droning on a little bit. Our last in the series is next week, and we're actually going to use that to launch a report at the same time on that same day. And that report will be by Arcadis and Richard Collins. Hands up if you know or remember Richard from various consultancy and from journalism, etc. What Arcadis did on ACOR's behalf is we went out and we looked at all existing waste reduction targets by jurisdiction, not new ones, existing ones. And then we matched that against actual performance in terms of what every state is up to in terms of the publicly announced targets that it has, whether it's C&D, C&I, MSW, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you don't know how you're going against old targets, how can we feel any sense of confidence about things like an 80% national target? Yeah. So it's a very interesting report. Some might want to take a bet on how many of the overall targets got met or didn't get met. Richard also took a look at, because it's very material in this regard, how much remaining landfill space we have per jurisdiction. So we're going to release that result next week on this phone call. Alrighty. God bless you. God bless you and the horse you rode in on.
Thanks, Pete.
Be well.
Thanks, Pete. Okay. See you, everybody.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks.